Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Astral Radiance, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be doing a Cube review from Astral Radiance. Cube is my favourite way to play the Pokemon trading card game. In fact, it's my favourite thing in the world. Cube is phenomenal, and I always want to give it a little moment in the limelight, because there are some interesting cards from every set that can sometimes impact your Cube. So let's take a look first at new supporter cards that we have at our disposal. First of all, Silene seems pretty interesting. For the majority of the time, you play sometimes singleton, sometimes just lower or limited counts of certain cards. So having that flexible option of recovering anything from a discard pile seems very cool. Gardenia's Vigor, trying to catch up with Fire in how much acceleration it has in supporter form is pretty interesting. And just having a couple copies of Gardenia's Vigor could open the floodgates for a number of previously like underpowered stage 2 grass type Pokemon in general. And giving it that little bit of extra push for acceleration could completely breathe new life into these sorts of decks. And I know from experience that even just like one Welder, one Blacksmith can really tip a type over the edge and really make like 3 and 4 energy attack costing archetypes viable. Gardenia's Vigor could now be doing that for the grass stuff. So keep it in mind, it will drastically change how strong your grass line is, so bear it in mind, even just one copy, because if you're playing those VS Seekers, those Power Pads, all sorts of supporter recovery, if someone can dip this a few times, it means they have a steady chain of attackers, so one to be careful of, but I think it's clearly worse than the likes of Welder and Blacksmith, so it should be pretty reasonable. Kamado, not necessarily one of the stronger cards, but something that can help out if you are trying to play singleton. Same can really be said for Zissou and Choi, to be honest. Choi giving you a bit of control, looking at your opponent's hand, could be a little bit more interesting than just the straight draw 3s. Zissou being an upgrade on Battle Reporter. We can throw that one in the bin now and just play Zissou instead, which is kind of cool. Irida seems very cool for some water types. Water is already one of the more blessed types, just in terms of what supports we have in general, but it's really cool to see this get its own, like, Karina, basically, which is pretty solid. And Roxanne, just for an extra comeback mechanic card if you really want it. I don't think she's necessarily crazy strong, so may still be outshone by other supporters, but could be an option in your cube as well. These are typically just really, really helpful cards if you're trying to remain Puritan in terms of singletons, so these are all nice includes for you. For trainers and stadiums, Trekking Shoes seems like an interesting card. If you're already playing Acrobike, think about adding a Shoes into your cube as well. Featherball, depending on the cube, depending on how many free retreat mons you have, definitely play it by ear. If it's something where there's only like 3 or 4 targets in your entire cube, it's going to be pointless. If you have certain evolution lines that could really benefit off this, a couple that we'll look at later, the likes of like Yanmega, for example, could really enjoy a card like this. So if you have multiple type Pokemon that have free retreat naturally, or lots of supporting mons that have a free retreat, Featherball could be a nice include in your cube. Hisuian Heavy Ball, one that I absolutely adore as well. Prizes are the bane of a Cuba's existence, so grabbing the Gladians, grabbing the Hisuians, grabbing the Azelfs are integral. Even grabbing Island Hermit can be huge. So Hisuian Heavy seems like a really, really nice card to have. And you know me, I'm always building around one basic and trying to recycle it as much as possible, so that gets even more valid for me now. And Jubilife Village seems like a nice stadium to have as well. Just a little bit of extra consistency that both players can use. It does force your turn to end, of course. So similar to Beach. And it's much lower budget, which is obviously a good include for you if you don't want to fork out for the old beaches. Let's have a look at a couple helpful basics as well. Shaman seems okay for those going second. It does have a 1 for 30 attack, limiting it from very low power, but I think it's fine for like mid and above, which is pretty cool. Hisuian Basculin seems good at every power level. Really does challenge things like Dunsparce and stuff, being even stronger than that in very low power, which I think is exceptional. I'm happy to see that, to be honest. Obviously, you don't have the paralysis flips, but a guaranteed 10 is also pretty good, and just having a free attack cost means you can retreat into it more reasonably and just get going in the game, so I think that's awesome. And Diancie, thanks to its hit points and its attack, probably limited again to sort of mid-high, but that Princess Curtain is once again relevant, especially if you want to have Gust in the cube. You can make it more relevant of text, and it has just inherent poke, pressure, and draw. Seems very solid in like mid power, especially if you are choosing to play gust effects in your cube. It could really come in clutch in sort of random turns in games where you need to set something up for a knockout, but make sure your opponent doesn't like gust up your evolving like stage 1 Pokemon. You can just leave like a basic with 3 energies attached to it, ready to evolve the following turn. So it could create some interesting board states and interactions there. So I think it could be a cool one to try out as well. Now we're going to look at some of the more sort of popular evolution lines and includes that we get from Astral Radiance. First one's Electrode. If you aren't bothered about the Hisuian text and have the mix and match, you get a really interesting new Voltorb that is great if you go second. Again, that sort of 0 energy attack cost is really appealing because you can like pay retreat into this guy and get a little bit of extra acceleration, which is cool. And the Electrode itself is another 0 energy attacker, so it requires no commitment, and you can start putting pressure on the opponents. 50 damage sort of puts it in that sort of mid to high power level category where you can set up Pokemon quite happily but won't be knocking them out, of course. And 50 typically stays out of range of most basics as well, so it feels like it's decent pressure but not going to be overwhelming, which is great. Or you can just use it to draw if you are in a tough spot. And we already like Electrode. It fills that niche already of being an early pressure attacker with a couple 1 energy attack costing Electrode in here, and it can also have that backup of draw with magnetic draw or just some acceleration. So it gives this deck a new dimension. Or sorry, it gives the stage 1 line a new dimension of having a pressure attack option as well in here, and another type coverage as well. So a really interesting include for Electrode. Yanmega, one of my favorites. I use this personally in my cube, and I think this exact Yanmega will be making it because it fits the theme of the current Yanmegas that we have very, very nicely. Wide Wing does 40 plus 80 if you have more cards in hand than your opponent, and lots of other Yanmegas are playing around with their own hand size, so it fits the theme perfectly. It's like a throwback, basically, where you have trying to match hand sizes, you have trying to be exactly 4 cards, and now you have the option to go above your opponent in hand size, so you can really have an interesting back and forth with the opponent where they're trying to play around certain things. You can try and respond accordingly with the correct Yanmega, which I think is very interesting. And a small note on the new Yanma, it has free retreat, which is great. Drifblim as well, one of those ones that's kind of getting there. I really like Delivery and Lifting from Stormfront. I think it's a really cool Drifblim. We're still not quite at that point where we have enough, but this is just a nice 1 attachment, 50 and 2 counters to the opponent's bench. It's a good pressure option, and I think if you want to have Delivery and Lifting, this could now be a attacking presence if you want to have a thicker Drifblim line in your cube. So something to bear in mind. Again, sort of fits in that mid power category of being a potentially really efficient attacking threat, so bear that in mind. Mismagius, also really interesting. I'm amazed at how low this card's hit points is, because lots of Mismagius have jumped themselves up to 110 hit points. So this is a throwback to 90 HP, which is really cool. It has a very disruptive attack and can also confuse as well with its second attack, and only doing 50 damage means it can fit into some lower power where you see things like Magical Trans Mismagius as well. Yes, this would be an attacking presence, but it fits the general theme of Mismagius having a little bit of control element in here as well, a bit of disruption, and doesn't hit so hard that it's unusable, and that's rare for newer cards these days. So getting a new sort of mid-power Mismagius is an interesting one to bear in mind. Gallade, also very cool for that higher power level. Naturally, we're talking about high power a lot of the time just because of the nature of the hit points that we're getting to now and the damage output that we can be smacking, and this Gallade is no different. Dealing 160, having 160 puts this at the very tippy top of the power level, and having an inherent buddy catch ability of grabbing guaranteed supporters is crazy. So if you want to have very high power level 1 prize cubes, Gallade is up there, and I have Guardy Gallade in my cube. I think this one is too strong for mine, but maybe with more sets to come, this will eventually make it into my cube as I slowly creep up my power level. Togekiss, also a really interesting one. I like that this is only 130 hit points as a stage 2 and only hits 120 for 3. Yes, that's good damage output in a lot of cubes, but it means that it's not just limited to high power. It can find itself coming down to mid power, which I think is really important here, because that's where a couple of the other Togekiss that we have sit, where they at the moment just serve the role of getting you a ton of energy into play. Now you can give the Togekiss line an extra dimension of having healing, which I think is really cool. Even if you don't like the Stage 2 or think it's too powerful potentially to have a heal 90 on an evolving Pokemon, you could just upgrade your Togepi's and Togetix as well. So I think that's really cool if you already have Serene Grace in your cube. Now you can give yourself some more interesting lower evolutions and see how that little bit of healing, you know, only 30 and only 10, can be a lot more subtle than just having the Stage 2 Togekiss just be chucked in and be a new powerhouse card. You can have the more subtle tones of these other pre-evolutions, which I think is really cool, and makes the Serene Grace just like, do nothing, do nothing, do nothing, here's tons of energy, now my strategy starts. You can be like, having these Togekicks and Togepi's still reasonable in like the mid to late game, where they can give you some comeback potential, which I think is a new interaction that the archetype didn't really have before. Kleavor's interesting as well if you like sort of having multiple evolutions. I think Kleavor sits in that high power level. Routes does really, really high damage. Think of it as Mindjack Zoroark, and typically that's going to be too strong. Dealing 150 as well for 3 is quite powerful, obviously, but does self-damage, so it's normally going to be coming in for 1 hit and then getting response KO'd in most situations in higher power level. But it could give Scizor a breath of life, because there are some interesting ones, of course, and you know, now you give yourself another type coverage and a different attacking presence. So if you want to have something that can hit like a truck, the Kleavor could be nice in a Scizor evolution line. Similar for Hisuian Sneasler, if you like having Weavile in your line, this Hisuian Sneasler seems to fit mid-high power quite well. 60 for 2 is quite dangerous, and the ability is strong, so I think it would be one of the best picks that you could have of a Weavile line. But I don't think it's like absolutely insane. Maybe its hit points put it a little bit too high on that scale, but I know that people do like Weavile, so I wanted to mention the Sneasler as an option here. Magnezone as well, one that I have currently in my cube, and I'm looking to replace Magnetic Circuit, actually, a 1-for-1 trade-out for this new Giga Magnet. I think it could be something where you have it in addition to Magnetic Circuit, or you just swap it out, because I think Giga Magnet is one of those things that's more sort of like, you just leave it to its own devices, you evolve up, and every now and then you get extra attachments, which I think is solid, whereas Magnetic Circuit is like an entire build around where you start drafting Fisherman, you start drafting Energy Retrieval, you start drafting all this other stuff just to make the deck work. Whereas this guy, you just put him into play and he kind of like accumulates value over the game, which I think is a much nicer way to have him. And it makes, I feel like the card is stronger like this anyway, because your deck inherently isn't like completely wrecked by playing like 15 basic energy and you do nothing until you get Magnetic Circuit. Now it's like the magnet's just helpful, but you already have other acceleration means, which I think is just like where I want my Magnezone line to be. So I'm happy to see it for sure. Next up I have Eevee, again a really popular evolution line. I really like this Resonant Evolution ability on Eevee because it gets rid of one of the biggest issues with Energy Evolution, which is tempo. Sometimes there's lots of Stage 1 evolutions in people's cubes, but the tempo of just going Energy Evolution and insta attack with one of those evolved Pokemon can be really dangerous. I'm thinking about things like Plasma Espeon, for example, or just some Plasma Leafeon. These sorts of Pokemon where they can get instant value just by bench Eevee, attach, turns out I can smack you with this Stage 1 out of nowhere for 1 attachment. I think Resonant Evolution gets rid of that sort of feels bad factor because you don't have the same tempo of Energy Evolution, but you can still build a board quite nicely. So I'd really like to see some of these splicing in, because it does lean towards people building Eevee boxes rather than just finding like one Energy Evolution and finding like the best type that's relevant to you and having like a 1 attachment bop kind of Pokemon. It might lead people more towards playing Eevee box, which I think is a fun thing to sort of build around and a challenge for people. It makes itself its own evolution like line as an identity rather than just like let us cherry pick here and there based on the color of energy that we're building. And similar to that end, you could try having Energy Garden Leafeon, where it can allow you to have the sort of Eevee box, and you can play multiple different types of energy because the garden can help you get them into play, which I think is pretty interesting. This hit points and damage output leaves it probably to higher power level. because 120 is pretty good, and of course there's a level X that can help you accelerate even further, and I do really like Leafeon as that option, especially because there's already Plasma Leafeon, so have a couple Leafeon in your cube, and then have the level X as well as an option, could be pretty interesting. So I do like this option. Obviously you don't have to play Leafeon in an EV box, and if you do play Energy Evolution, this could be a really early game way to get a ton of energies into play, and it could be a creative way to build your deck as well. So I really do like this option, and I probably will be splicing it into my cube as well. And then we will end up on some mutant considerations. These are basically for evolution lines that don't really have a home just yet. You know, we've only just started getting Weird cards, and it means that you can't just pack your cube with a ton of these unless you really want to. But I think this could be pretty interesting in mutants, where you can just shove a ton of the most powerful stuff that we have into one big pot, and Weird fits that fairly well, as does Hisuian Decidueye. Its raw damage output isn't high, and it requires some setup, which makes it kind of a balancing act. Even though it can hit crazy numbers, it can't just one-shot stuff. It needs to have prepped that damage here and there, which I think is cool, and has an 80 snipe, which is dangerous, but not like back-breaking, which is really cool to see. The Hisuian Samurott has ridiculous hit points and can draw a ton of cards, but in Mutant, I think this is pretty reasonable. And Basculegion seems okay as well as a response sort of attacking option. I think one thing about Mutant is that the combat cards are really important, so that you don't just get out-tempoed by the first person who starts evolving, because there's crazy wombo combos happening in Mutant. So having cards like Basculegion that's just one attach, respond, hit a really good chunk of damage, and start clawing back into the game, whilst not being one of those cards that you could use as player one who evolved first. It's only doing 30 damage. That's not the same sort of pressure. So I really like having these sorts of cards sort of baked into Mutant, because it deals with one of the main issues of Mutant inherently, is that wombos happen, and it's really hard. Like, the snowball just happens so quickly in Mutant, I find. So having cards like this is really huge. So that's it for my cube updates of Astral Radiance. Let me know what cards you are going to be splicing in. It's unfortunate that it's mostly high power builders that get to benefit from new sets coming out these days, but there's still a few interesting supporter cards and trainers for all of us to get our hands on and get building with. If you haven't jumped into Cube, please watch some of the other videos that we have on the channel. Just look at some of the guides and whatnot. I still think it's one of the most fun things. I'll try and have some links in the description below. So yeah, certainly check it out. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.